Welcome to the Innovation Implementation Cycle, Plan and Implement. Your trainer for this session is Education Specialist Rebecca Peterson from the Utah State Board of Education. During this segment, we will discuss how to analyze the proposed solutions or treatments defined in the Identify Needs stage to determine which proposed solution will most likely address the needs. The Hexagon Tool will provide the format for guiding the implementation planning process. We hope that you find this training informative, useful, but ultimately we hope that this training can help your school community council to amplify the likelihood of student success by leveraging the power of the science of successful innovation implementation through the application of the Innovation Implementation Cycle. Now that you have correctly diagnosed the problem, so that's the previous step, you've diagnosed this problem, you've identified some potential treatments or innovations and interventions, it's time to decide what you are actually going to implement and how you're going to do it. So on this graphic, you can see you've already identified needs. So now we're going to talk about how are we going to actually put these things into place. The recipe for positive student outcomes is actually a really helpful image, I think, of describing what research shows about what actually results in positive student outcomes. So there's 3 ingredients in this recipe. You've got effective interventions, effective implementation methods, and enabling contexts. When those 3 components are present, then that's when you maximize the probability of positive outcomes for students. So let's define the parts of our positive student outcomes equation. Effective interventions are critical to student success. We have a limited amount of time to work with students. We do not want to waste that time, that precious time that we have, implementing something that has a low probability of positively impacting the student outcomes we hope to see. By selecting interventions that have the highest probability of success, we maximize the likelihood that students will progress. To put this in more familiar terms, think about a time that you or your child had a sore throat. That kind of a sore throat where you would rather spit than swallow. Maybe you had a fever, possibly a slightly upset stomach. With those symptoms, you go to the doctor, collect more data, evaluate the results to find out if you have a bacterial infection, like strep throat, or a viral infection. The doctor runs a strep test, in other words, collects additional information, and identifies the culprit. It happens to be the Streptococcus bacteria. You have strep throat. Now that the problem's been correctly identified, a treatment can be proposed and implemented. The diagnosis is important because if the infection was viral, the antibiotic treatment wouldn't help. However, since the infection is bacterial, antibiotics could be a good option. There may be several options published online for treating strep throat infections. Sometimes, you search the blogosphere or you ask Google, and you might find things ranging from gargling with garlic oil, placing onions on the soles of your feet, all the way to treatment with a penicillin-based antibiotic, and everything else in between those options. So your physician quickly runs through all of the options and selects the treatment or intervention that has the highest probability of addressing the problem. And he or she prescribes a dose of, in this case, we'll say amoxicillin. So that's the first part of the equation, selecting an intervention that maximizes the probability for success. However, identifying an effective intervention is only part of the process. You must have an effective way to implement the treatment. So let's go back to the strep throat example for a moment. Let's say you hate to swallow pills. They make you gag and throw up. If the doctor prescribed you amoxicillin in a pill, is it likely that you'd be able to obtain the benefits of the effective treatment? Without a way to actually have you ingest the antibiotic, you'll not have the positive outcomes that you desire. Luckily, amoxicillin can be delivered in liquid form, which does not make you throw up. So now you have an effective way to receive the intervention, the amoxicillin. There's an effective implementation method that allows you to receive that benefit of the intervention, taking it in liquid form. The second part of our equation is now accounted for. So this leaves the third part, enabling contexts. An enabling context is present when the people, surroundings, and necessary support are available to facilitate implementation of the intervention. So revisiting our strep throat story, we have an effective intervention, the amoxicillin, an effective way to implement the intervention, liquid dosing, but the medication must be refrigerated and you must likely take it 4 times per day. Unfortunately, you still need to go to work, and you don't have access to a refrigerator or a way to keep the medication cold at work. You find that the context of your work environment conflicts with the requirements of the treatment. Let's say that you decide to take the antibiotic with you to work anyway because you decide that some treatment, it's better than none. Unfortunately, though, you find that you can't actually break away from your tasks at work to take the medication the required number of times during your 12-hour shift. In this scenario that I just painted, you do not have an enabling context that makes it possible for you to implement the effective treatment and the effective implementation method with any kind of fidelity. Now let's say, on the other hand, that maybe you work at a place where you have access to a refrigerator and you can take a break to take your medication as directed. In that case, you would now work in an environment that provides an enabling context for implementing your treatment. So thinking back to the components of the equation, we've got our 3 effective interventions, effective implementation methods, and enabling contexts. What happens when any one of those are missing? Another way to look at this equation is to put the number 3 in each of the blue boxes. And just for fun, let's pretend that the operation symbols are addition symbols instead of multiplication symbols. In that case, we would get 3 plus 3 plus 3, yielding a result of 9. Not bad. Now let's use the equation as it's written, with multiplication. Now our 3's turn into 3 times 3 times 3, and our result is 27. Better. However, what happens to our results if any one of the blue components is a 0? If we select an effective intervention and we don't have the support of parents, teachers, and administrators, or if we select an effective intervention and we have the support of parents, teachers, and administrators, but we don't have an effective way to implement the intervention, the net effect on our students will be 0. And as University of North Carolina researcher Karen Blasey stated, students cannot benefit from interventions or instructional practices they do not receive. Let's focus on the first part of the equation, effective interventions. Selecting an effective intervention is a critical component of the planning stage in the innovation implementation cycle. In order for an innovation or intervention to be usable or useful, it must be accessible by all people involved. To be usable, it's necessary to have sufficient detail about an intervention. With detail, you can train educators to implement it with fidelity, replicate it across multiple settings, and you can measure the use of the intervention. What was the last new practice maybe curriculum, program, innovation, your school or your business, family, or other organization adopted. Have you ever adopted a practice that ultimately did not work as well as you would have liked? What were some barriers to those desired outcomes? A quick example from my life has to do with my perennial goal of eating well. The fact that this goal is recurring should tell you something about my success with complete implementation. Last year, I had the goal of eating at least 3 servings of vegetables a day. There's lots of great evidence about the positive impacts of eating a diet high in vegetables. Good recipes and availability of vegetables in easily accessible places makes it easy to have them close at hand. However, my implementation plans and enabling contexts have not been fully developed or likely even fully planned. Barriers include getting tired of eating the same veggies that I tend to always eat, children who are maybe a little bit less enthusiastic about the idea, and prioritizing the time to plan, prepare, and even the time to just eat. In an academic environment, implementing new curriculum, maybe new teaching practices, culture change efforts, maybe new methods of communication or grading are likely to be present in one form or another in most schools across the state. Many times, the expectations and enthusiasm at the start of a project can turn into frustration as time goes on. Well, why is that the case? What are some of the barriers to successful implementation of good ideas? Pause the presentation to reflect and discuss this idea for a moment or two before continuing. So how can you determine whether any particular innovation or intervention is usable? One evaluative tool that is extremely useful is the Hexagon Tool. This discussion tool, created by the researchers at the University of North Carolina's National Implementation Research Network, or NIRN, N-I-R-N, facilitates discussion about the essential components that maximize the probability of selecting an intervention that's likely to succeed in your environment. There are 6 key areas to consider when deciding what intervention or innovation you're going to implement. When you discuss, evaluate, and make decisions about implementation based on these 6 areas for each of your possible innovations and interventions, you're maximizing the probability of selecting an innovation or intervention that will ultimately be able to impact student outcomes. Pause this presentation and download the Hexagon Tool from the website that is linked on here, or simply type in Hexagon Tool NIRN, N-I-R-N, into your search engine to find the document. You may want to save this Hexagon Tool to your desktop for easy reference. There's a bit of pre-planning and work that needs to be done in order to make your meeting time effective when using the Hexagon Tool. Ideally, you should have already identified the problem, and you should have selected some innovations or interventions that you'd like to evaluate. It is helpful to have that information available about the evidence base, the requirements for implementation, and to have those things available at your meeting. This can be accomplished by assigning people to be in charge of bringing information to the meeting about a particular innovation or intervention in some sort of summary format. Some teams divide up the tasks among everyone. Some teams have a designated group in charge of background research. Some teams do the research during the meeting itself, though this tends to be less efficient and tends to make for really long meetings. Make sure that you've identified your stakeholders. Who has an interest in what you're discussing? Who will be likely to feel the effects or be the boots on the ground related to the problem and the potential interventions that you've identified? Once you know who should be included in your discussions, make sure that they're aware of them and, as possible, have them present at the meeting. The Hexagon Tool is really pretty easy to use. You'll notice that there are instructions for how to use the tool on page 1. Page 3 has a place to record your scores for each innovation or intervention, and page 4 is the start of the discussion questions. For each innovation and intervention, you will review and discuss the questions for each indicator. You may want to set a time limit for discussion and have the timekeeper and facilitator work to keep the discussion focused and effective. You will also want to have a designated note taker to keep track of the big ideas or important points from the discussion. At the conclusion of the time for discussing the indicator, assign a score of 1 to 5 and record it. For example, the first indicator is evidence. If my team designated 7 minutes to talk about evidence for our first proposed intervention, the timekeeper and facilitator would work together to lead the discussion through the questions, and then at the conclusion of the time, the team would choose a score for the evidence indicator. This process is then repeated for the remaining 5 indicators until all of them are discussed as they related to proposed intervention 1. Complete the same analysis for all proposed interventions. After all of the notes and ratings are complete, use the information from the discussion to make a recommendation about which innovation or intervention would be best to implement. But it's one thing to talk about the Hexagon tool, but it's far better to experience. So let's try it. Looking at your academic proficiency data, you identify a problem. There's a distinct drop in math proficiency scores between 3rd and 4th grades. However, you also notice that basic computation skills are strong. Along with a few other symptoms, your team determines that you need to make a diagnosis. Why is this drop occurring? Is it related to classroom behavior management, curriculum options, less effective teaching methods? So you do some data analysis. Further data analysis reveals that the drop is related to a gap in understanding of fractions at the end of 3rd grade. That becomes more evident and problematic for students when they're in 4th grade. You determine that the lack of understanding of fractions is causing the symptoms of that drop in math proficiency measures. So now your team identifies some potential solutions, some treatments. Your team works to identify feasible opportunities to address the problem that you identified. The team suggests 3 opportunities or interventions. First, hire a paraprofessional to do remedial one-on-one and small group tutoring using materials that the school already has. Second, purchase a computer software program for all 3rd grade students that can provide computer adaptive instruction, such as Alex. Third, hire a math instructional coach to work with teachers to improve instruction. Now that you've completed the step identify needs in the implementation cycle, you move on to the next step, plan. Your team found some viable intervention options. However, you are a wise and savvy team that recognizes the importance of selecting the intervention that will have the highest probability of success. While each team member has their own personal preference, and there are a few testimonials by each team member for each of their options, the team chooses to use the Hexagon tool to guide their discussion and decision-making process. Pause the presentation and go through the Hexagon tool. You may choose to do an abbreviated experience by just reviewing the questions in each section briefly and quickly, and assigning a quick score for each indicator during your hypothetical intervention evaluation. Start with evidence on page 4. In the hypothetical situation, you may not have actual evidence, so in this situation, you can make it up. Then move on to the next indicator, usability, once you've assigned a rating for evidence. Once you feel comfortable with the structure, layout, and components of the Hexagon tool, and you've applied the questions and ratings for each indicator to at least one of the hypothetical interventions, then resume the presentation. Take just a minute or two to consider how the Hexagon tool shaped your discussions. What's different between making decisions with and without the use of the Hexagon tool? Many times schools and teams who use this tool notice that their discussions seem to be more directed, more relevant, and it helps them to consider things that they hadn't considered before. How can you implement this process in your school community council meetings? So now that you've identified needs and planned your treatment, you're ready to focus on implementation. So we just finished the plan component. So we've done identify needs and plan, and now we're going to talk about implementation. So as we discussed earlier in our step throat example, effective implementation methods and enabling contexts are both critical components in facilitating student access to effective innovations and interventions. As we plan for implementation, it's important to spend time thoroughly considering how we will carry out the innovation or intervention, also known as, from the strep throat example, as the treatment, and what contexts and situations will need to be present in order for that innovation or intervention to be able to be successful. Principles of implementation science will help us to maximize the opportunities for and the probability of student success. Let's do a quick review about some of the main ideas involved in implementation science, or implementation that works. There's a video interview on YouTube, and it's also linked from the University of North Carolina's NIRN, N-I-R-N site, with Dean Fixon and Karen Blasey, where they discuss the findings of their research. And what they find is that in systems and organizations where all of the different components that are likely to make implementation successful are present, when those things exist, that you tend to get 80% implementation, and it takes about 3 years to get there. The contrast to that, the flip side, is when people want to implement an intervention or an innovation, but they don't have all of the components in place. So the things that are included in that Hexagon tool and the structures to support those things, you tend to get 14% implementation, and it takes about 17 years to get there. So I don't know about you, but what I found is that none of my children were in K to 12 long enough for something to be kind of haphazardly implemented, and as a teacher, I didn't have that kind of time. I couldn't wait 17 years to get something implemented. So the goal of implementation science is to reduce the gap between what we know and what we do, to determine what the factors are that make it more likely that an innovation or intervention will be successfully implemented. As Blasey and Fixon point out in their interview and on their research page on the NIRN website, implementation quality is directly related to outcomes. It's a causative relationship. So thinking back to the strep throat example, by not being able to implement the treatment, so for example, the antibiotics that would need to be refrigerated and taken multiple times a day, but your work didn't allow you to actually implement that, then you significantly decrease the likelihood of a positive outcome from the treatment. If implementation quality is compromised, the results tend to reflect decreased impact as well. So the idea, going back to this idea about 80% implementation in 3 years versus 14% implementation in 17 years. How likely is it that students would see benefits of innovations or interventions that are not carefully planned and implemented with fidelity? We don't have 17 years to waste, especially if those 17 years only result in 14% implementation. That's like saying that if we will treat your strep infection, but we don't really collect information about what works, other than we know that the antibiotic itself kills streptococcus bacteria, and we know that amoxicillin must be ingested. If we're not too worried about the different methods used to deliver our treatment, then that's where you're going to see that gap. Ultimately, if we just decide, well, maybe we could rub it on people's skin, or, you know, maybe I don't like the taste of it at all, you know, so maybe I'll just sleep next to it. In that case, if you get, you know, some people who are willing to implement, some people who are not, you don't have structures to support and to train and to put things into place using the data from the NIRN research, only 14 people out of 100 would receive any benefit from that antibiotic due to the random way that the treatment is being implemented, with some people maybe doing it correctly, some people not, some people doing it partially, but you'd have to wait 17 years to get to that level of effectiveness. Often within school initiatives are not implemented with the same quality as the program designers initially intended, resulting in poor outcomes. When we use implementation science principles, you'll find that that's when you see a more cost-effective use of the tools overall, and it is more efficient in promoting positive change. There are 3 degrees of implementation. We've got paper implementation, process implementation, and performance implementation. Unfortunately, most innovations and interventions stay firmly rooted in paper implementation and then never make it to the process or performance implementation. New policies are created, new procedure manuals are written because an innovation or intervention is being adopted, or because there are outside influences that are the driving force, things like accreditation or other requirements. However, with paper implementation, creation of policies and procedure manuals is where things end. It is filing cabinet level implementation. It is estimated that 80 to 90% of people-dependent innovations get stuck at paper implementation. And education is definitely a people-dependent process. People-dependent innovations happen in education. Process implementation is a step up from paper implementation. In process implementation, the work of implementation begins. If people make it past paper implementation, process implementation is where many school initiatives unfortunately stop. A new practice or policy is adopted, described, and training is provided, but that's where it stops. The focus is on the process itself as opposed to focusing on the results obtained by implementing the process. Use of the innovation implementation cycle leads to performance implementation. Performance implementation is the level that we must attain in order to benefit students. In performance implementation, procedures and processes are clearly defined and carefully planned and are put into place effectively. Implementation coaching is built into the system. Data are collected that tell the story about how the implementation is working, and adjustments and improvements are made based on the data. If you were to ask someone who is involved in performance implementation what they are implementing, why they are implementing it, and what successful implementation looks like, where they are in the process of implementation, and how they know that, they could tell you. So this phrase is a great phrase. Name the baby. What does naming a baby do? Why not just call all babies baby? When we name the baby, we are identifying specifically one particular baby. By naming the baby, this allows us to successfully communicate, plan, and address concerns related to specific situations. It erases the ambiguity associated with him, her, those, them, as well as non-specific terms like some, it, more, less, a lot, etc. For example, what does go get some more for him direct you to do? Without specific context, can you answer the questions, which him? More of what? How much is more? In implementation, naming the baby refers to creating a well-defined workable plan to implement an innovation or intervention. When we name the baby, our direction changes to go get 8 ounces of warm milk and a bottle for Matt. Much more specific, less room for misunderstanding and misinterpretation, much more actionable, and it's easy to evaluate. Many times when there are disagreements or feelings of dissatisfaction related to an innovation or intervention, they are due to missed expectations. Something was expected and was not delivered, or there's a mismatch between the expectations of one person and the expectations of another. Clearly naming the baby helps to avoid missed expectations. When missed expectations do occur, naming the baby provides a framework to facilitate discussion and problem solving. There are 3 stages that implementation of an innovation or intervention passes through: installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. On average, successful implementation of a new practice takes 2 to 4 years. For a moment, consider the impact of changing the treatment every year within your school trust lands plan. While plans are rewritten every year, there is not a requirement that the innovation or intervention must be changed every year. From a lens of implementation science, it makes much more sense to plan a 3-year implementation. While school trust land plans cannot be written for 3 years at a time, they can be mapped out in your discussions, recorded in your minutes, and defined 1 year at a time, with an eye on what things will look like at year 3. You can name the baby for installation. What does that look like? Initial implementation, well, what does that look like? And what does full implementation look like? Clear plans for implementation accomplish the following things. They define how and when effective, aligned, and plausible interventions will be selected, and they define who will be involved in selecting them. When the innovations or interventions are selected, the plan describes exactly what the innovation or intervention is, how the innovations and interventions are expected to impact student outcomes, and it justifies the expectation based on evidence. This is the information that you've collected when you use the Hexagon tool. Effective plans describe how implementation will occur. What is the plan to provide and evaluate coaching and training? What does success look like during installation and during the initial stages of implementation? How long do we think those stages will take? Where do we expect to be in year 1? The beginning of year 2, the end of year 2, in year 3. What will it take to get there? Who does what by when, and how will we know? Successful plans and clear plans also define a method to track fidelity of implementation. So as a team, you decide what are the critical components that must be in place by year 1. So what are those things that if you don't include them in your implementation will mean that the implementation is not it's not complete, it's not likely to be successful. So what do those look like? What does that look like at the end of year 1, end of year 2, end of year 3? What does fidelity look like for each of those components? What indicators will tell us if we're on the right track? How will we know if we need to make adjustments or improvements? Clear plans also detail how progress will be monitored. What does success look like at full implementation? What student outcomes do we expect to change? Work backwards from full implementation, and then determine, well, where do we expect to be at year 2 and at year 1? How will we know if we're on the right track or we need to make a course correction? Finally, a good implementation plan describes the conditions and processes that guide adaptation and improvement. When will the fidelity of implementation be reviewed? When will student outcome data be reviewed? How is acceptable progress defined for both implementation and outcomes over the year? What do we do if acceptable progress is not evident? What do we do if it is? Looking ahead, you have the task of writing your next school trust lands plan. As you prepare to write up your next plan, take the time to clearly name your baby and define the components that will enable your success. Some things to consider. What are we going to address? What need did we identify? What is our proposed innovation or intervention to address that need? How does this connect to last year's plan? Or does it connect to last year's plan? Is this year going to be year one? What does implementation with fidelity look like? Can we identify the key components of fidelity? And how are we going to identify and evaluate whether or not those things are in place? What are the anticipated effects on student outcomes? So if we implement this thing that we're thinking about, what do we think is going to change? How do we define our success criteria at year one, year two? How will we know if we're making progress? What are our indicators? When do we examine them? Again, what does success look like, and how will we know when we get there? So these items, as you are considering your plan moving forward, are things that you're going to want to consider, because when you have planned in for defining your plan with clarity, like we talked about on the last slide, and talk about what does success look like, that gives you a way to be able to measure and then adjust as necessary moving forward. As with all good ideas, unless they're written down and reviewed, our ideas become victim of our own imperfect memories. Once your implementation plans are defined, be sure that they're written down and then review the plans regularly. Make notes about things that are working well as areas of difficulty. Reflect on these items during your meetings. But most importantly, remind yourself about how you eat an elephant. One bite at a time. Remember that successful implementation takes time, and it takes more planning, doing, analyzing, evaluating, and adjusting than most people realize. Commit to continue on your implementation path, one bite at a time. Thank you for participating in this training module and for investing in the success of your team, your school, and above all, for investing in the success of your students. This is the end of the presentation on planning and implementing.